Hello everyone. As we saw in the last episode, the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was where the Aztec vision of their cosmic order and their empire were founded. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a sergeant in Cortes's army, left us a description of what he saw. He said, quote, "We were amazed. The great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of the soldiers even asked whether the thing that we saw were not a dream. Gazing on such wonderful sights, we did not know what to say. Yet this amazement did not last. It turned into a cultural shock." Now, there were many things about Aztec society which were familiar for the Spanish. For example, Díaz and the other Spaniards were not at all shocked by the sight of slavery, the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, and the complete subjugation of women. In regard to these things, they were basically like amigos. But let's recall a moment during the conquest of the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. Bernal Díaz del Castillo also described another scene. Quote, "The dismal drum, horns, and things like trumpets. The sound of them all was terrifying. We all looked towards the lofty pyramid where they were being sounded and saw our comrades, whom they had captured, and they were taking them to be sacrificed. They immediately placed them on their backs. With some knives, they sawed open their chests and drew out their palpitating hearts and offered them to the idols that were there. And they kicked the bodies down the steps, and the Indian butchers who waited below cut off the arms and feet and flayed the skin off the faces and prepared it afterwards like a glove of leather with the beards on. And the bodies, that is their entrails and feet, they threw to the tigers and lions, which they kept in the house of the carnivores." Now, the Aztec practice of sacrifice was an obvious threat to the Spanish forces. The Spanish forces did not want to be sacrificed. They didn't want to be killed. However, there were numerous features of Mexica culture which would have also been jarring to the Spanish. One of which was the amount of blood. The Mexica were infamous for ripping out the still beating hearts of their victims, in many cases while their victims were still alive. And the Aztec capital was a very, very bloody place. The Aztecs called blood precious water. They considered blood to be divine and hence a very potent sacrificial offering. They even used blood to bless places. They smeared blood on the walls of the Templo Mayor. They also sprinkled blood on visiting dignitaries for the same reason. But it was not only the blood. The Mexica also incorporated flaying into their culture. Flaying being the removal of skin from the human body. Skin in the human. They even had a special holiday all about flaying corpses. It was known as Xipe, which roughly translates into either the festival of the flayed god or the feast of the flaying of men. This was a festival meant to honor the god Xipe Totec, also known as the flayed god or the flayed one, which also brings us to the topic of cannibalism. The Mexica practiced cannibalism mostly as part of their religious rituals. The Aztecs believed that they could acquire the vital life forces of another man by eating his body parts. In this sense, cannibalism was a means in the pursuit of immortality. And eating, all types of eating, was a major aspect of Mexica culture. They developed a cosmology, a spiritual worldview in which everything ate everything. Gods ate gods. Humans ate gods. Gods ate humans. Gods in the underworld ate the remains of humans, and humans in the underworld ate rotten tamales. This was a theme that one historian described as cosmic jaws, a theme of eating and grinding that pervaded Aztec symbols, prayers, and songs. Cortes responded to these violent and bloody aspects of Mexica culture by portraying himself as an agent of God. and his conquest as part of a sacred and divine plan, like a sort of 16th century version of a humanitarian mission. Now, empire building and colonization, justified as a means to make the world a better place, is kind of the bread and butter of Western imperialism. And indeed, Cortés immediately banned the practice of human sacrifice. And in his letters, he dwelt and emphasized these bloody aspects of Mexica culture. According to Cortés, he claimed that God sent him to America to end these bloody practices. The gist of Cortés's message was as follows: these bloodthirsty savages need Jesus, and we Spaniards are the ones who would instruct them in the ways of Christ. And so Cortés portrayed the subjugation and enslavement of the Mexica people as a humanitarian mission, as a way to save their souls. It was necessary to control these indigenous peoples to properly instruct them on how to be a proper Christian. And in this regard, historians draw numerous parallels to the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula, which preceded the Spanish conquest of America. After the end of the Reconquista and the conquest of Mexico, the Spaniards in both cases expected their political and military victory to be followed with a spiritual victory. Some historians even consider the Spanish conquest of America as part of the crusading tradition, and therefore one of the last crusades. Indeed, as we saw in the last episode, Cortés frequently compared the Mexica people to Moors, and Cortés also stylized himself as a sort of crusader. Cortés spoke about how he supposedly felt the presence of God at every step in his journey. That is, he saw God in every decision he made. He wrote, quote, "It seemed to me that God fought for us, since against such a multitude we returned unharmed." In his letters to the king, Cortés explicitly talked about how God directed his conquest, that Cortés's conquest was God's gift to the Spanish monarchy, as God's way of rewarding the Spaniards for being so devout and pious. He even used the term medium or medio to describe himself. That is, a mediator between the corporeal and spiritual worlds. Now, of course, some of this was propaganda. Cortés's conquest of the Mexica people was an illegal act. He was engaged in an act of mutiny while he conquered the Aztec Empire. And so part of this religious use of language and expressions was a sort of way to ask for forgiveness, like, it's okay, I broke the law because I work for the greater law of God. Nonetheless, this image of Cortés the Crusader was bolstered by the Franciscans. The Franciscans were one of the many religious orders in Catholic Europe. They were the first order to send Spanish priests in the conquest of America. And the Franciscans likely legitimately believed that the conquest of the Mexica people was God ordained. They had a tendency to see it in the same apocalyptic tradition of Columbus. That is, the conversion of the people living on this unknown world was part of the prophesied universal conversion of all humans in the world to Christianity, a necessary step for the second coming of Christ. And since Cortés brought humanity so much more closer to Jesus' return, they portrayed Cortés as a general of Christ. Each converted soul was one step closer to the return of Jesus. Cortés, the general, was creating a spiritual empire. He was creating cities of God. The Franciscans essentially served as Cortés's propaganda arm, his personal PR team. They helped him create this image of a holy conqueror, a man not acting out of greed or self-interest, but for the greater good of humanity. Because Jesus had the greater good of humanity in mind, according to their worldview. In this sense, the retaking of Jerusalem lost its importance because Cortes and the Spaniards were recreating a new Jerusalem, and the new souls that were being converted here would replace the old Jerusalem as one of the necessary steps for the end times.